So let me introduce our speakers. On my right here, I have Alan Wallace, who is an expert in Tibetan Buddhism, having been ordained as a monk by the Dalai Lama himself after studying for about 14 years. His many books discussed Eastern and Western scientific, philosophical, and contemplative modes of inquiry, often focusing on relationships between the sciences and Buddhism. He is the founder of the Santa Barbara Institute for Consciousness Studies, and he's very active both all over the world. He just told me that he spends 3 months a year only in Santa Barbara, the rest of the time traveling around. And he promotes all sorts of different workshops in places from Santa Barbara to Tuscany and beyond. He has a bachelor's degree in physics from Amherst College, and he has a PhD in religious studies from Stanford. So he is very much a person to listen to when we want to understand relationships between the sciences and spirituality, and particularly from the Buddhist tradition. So welcome, Alan. Thank you. Sean Carroll is an old friend. I've known him for many, many years when we both had a lot of hair. So he's a world-renowned theoretical physicist, and he specializes in cosmology in something called quantum field theory, which you can ask him what it is afterwards, and general relativity. And he is currently a research professor at Caltech. He has written many, many articles and essays for Nature, for the New York Times, for New Scientist, etc. And he authored 3 popular science books, including the last one, latest, not last, hopefully.
Oh, who knows?
The Big Picture, which became a New York Times bestseller. So he has appeared in many TV shows, about cosmology and science in general, and the History Channel, Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman, and the Colbert Report. And he survived, which is quite something. So his research focuses on the physics of the very early universe and the nature of the mysterious dark energy, right? His PhD is from Harvard. He was a postdoctoral fellow at MIT and at the Kavli Institute for Theoretical Physics in Santa Barbara. Was for a while a professor at the University of Chicago, and now he is a professor at Caltech. So welcome, Sean.
Thank you.
And he has a local following. That's great. So as you know, the topic tonight is very modest, right? The nature of reality. Something very simple to deal with in about 90 minutes. And I am not going to speak very much at all about it, but just ask you to remember that reality is much, much than just what we perceive with our senses. We may think that what's happening right now, you're sitting, you're listening, you can see me, and you realize, oh, this is my reality. Well, that's a very small sliver of what reality is. And in fact, even defining the word reality is quite complex. So we're going to have this opportunity, which is quite unique, I think, to listen from a theoretical physicist and a Buddhist scholar about their perspectives on the nature of reality. I remind them and you that the purpose of the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement is to have a constructive engagement between the sciences and the humanities so that we all can learn from one another. So our plan here is to start with Sean. So Sean is going to have about 20 minutes to talk, and then Alan will have another 20 minutes to talk. Then we'll talk among ourselves a little bit, and then we're going to open so that you can ask questions to all of us. So Sean, please.
Right. The nature of reality. I want it on the record that this was not my topic choice. I didn't invent it, but it seems maybe a little presumptuous or intimidating to talk about the very nature of reality, especially because as scientists, we instantly talk about what we don't know, right? I mean, I hope that no one thinks that they took a physics course and they were doing inclined planes and pendulums rocking back and forth, and that's what professional physicists do all day. We don't just go over the stuff we know over and over again. We go right to the stuff we don't know. And we love talking about what happened at the Big Bang or how to build a quantum computer. So when you talk about the nature of reality, good. There's plenty that we don't know. Part of what I want to argue for today is that there are some things that we do know. And in fact, there are interesting things that we do know that we don't always tell you about. So I want to make 2 points, if that's possible, and one of them will be perfectly obvious and trivial, and you'll wonder why I'm wasting your time. And the other one, you will not even agree with me. You will not believe what I tell you, and that's okay. You can go home and you can think about it. So the first point is the obvious one. The universe, the nature of reality, appears to us in layers. It does not appear to us as one single unified thing that we talk to in a single way. And this is a wonderful opportunity for engagement, cross-disciplinary engagement with the humanities and the sciences. But what I mean is the sort of very simple thing. The chair I'm sitting on right now, there's a way of talking about the chair. It's made of cloth and fabric and wood and metal. And that's a perfectly legitimate way of talking about the chair. There's another way which says the chair is a collection of atoms, of elementary particles held together by the laws of physics. And that is also a perfectly valid way of talking about the chair. And the fact that there's one way of talking does not invalidate the other way of talking. They had better be compatible with each other. They better be consistent. You can't say that there's one true fact that you derive from one way of thinking about the chair, one vocabulary or one story you're telling, and an incompatible different story you're telling the other way. The feature of reality that is fascinating and worthy of our consideration is that there are many overlapping, seemingly different, but ultimately compatible ways of talking about it. And that extends not only to describing the world, but to understanding it at a deep level. So we can think about the iPhone. This is my favorite example. My iPhone, like, what does it do? How do I talk about it? I mean, I know that if I push a certain button, I can talk to Siri on my iPhone. There's a way of talking about the phone that there are apps, and I push buttons, and I can get Google Maps, and I can go places. And there's another way of talking, which is, again, the language of fundamental physics, that phone is a collection of elementary particles and forces. And it turns out I understand the phone in both of those languages. I know what to do to push the buttons to get Google Maps up, and I can write down the equations to tell you what the electrons do. There's also an intermediate layer, a way of talking about the iPhone, which is that it's full of electronics, right? That there's integrated circuits, and there's wires and batteries and things like that. And if you ask me about that, I have no clue what is going on. How does the computational force actually work to make Google Maps figure out where to go? I have no idea what that is. It is a perfectly valid way of talking about the phone, right? So there's 3 layers, the layers of the fundamental particles, the layers of the electronics and the computational logic that powers the phone, and then there's a layer of the use, the application in our human world. They must be compatible with each other, and it's possible that we understand some of them and don't understand others. We all know how to get Google Maps up. My friends and I know how to write the equation for the electron. There are other people who know how to program the thing and make it go. And the fact that I don't know that layer does not mean that I'm worried that, in fact, when I hit the button and talk to Siri, that somehow maybe there's a little person in there named Siri, right? That would not be what I learned when my friends who understand the electronics told me, but what do they know? I don't understand anything about that. I'm not worried about that. Even though I don't know the details of the electronics and the programming, I'm convinced that they are perfectly compatible with the underlying atoms and particles, as well as with the emergent layer of a little phone that can give me directions to go wherever I want to go. The universe is like that. And there are things we understand about it and things we don't understand about it. And there's 2 temptations that work in opposite directions but are very strong. There's a temptation to say, you know what, we understand everything. Or, we don't understand everything today, but within a few years, we'll understand everything. This is a very common move in the history of physics, especially, from the 1800s up until very recently. You could talk to a physicist, and they're like, there's things we don't know, but it's just dotting I's and crossing T's. Any day now, we'll understand mostly everything. Very embarrassing to say those things. They never turn out to be true. I'm not going to say that, okay? But it's tempting. There's then another temptation, which is to say, we don't understand anything, right? Scientists talk about dark matter and dark energy in the Big Bang and quantum mechanics. Well, they don't understand any of that stuff. Therefore, anything goes. Anything could be true. Who knows, right? that is just as easy and lazy and wrong as saying that we understand everything. The hard, courageous thing is to say, well, we understand some things, we don't understand other things, and here is the dividing line between them. That's difficult, but that's what we have to do if we're honest about how we understand the world. So all that's trivial and obvious, and you understood that already. If you didn't buy my book, am I allowed to say that here? Sure. Buy my book.
Boy, they're selling it
Signing
right
the book afterward. My publisher likes when I say that. Okay. Here's the surprising thing that we don't always tell you. The world appears to us in layers. There is a layer of understanding the nature of reality, which has a certain domain of validity that includes everything in this room, which we understand perfectly. Okay? It's not the layer of human interactions, right? If you meet a person and you're trying to figure out, what are their motivations? Are they nice? And we don't understand that. We're not going to understand that anytime soon. There's many things that we don't understand, but there's a layer, which is, once again, that layer of the elementary particles and forces. You and I contain atoms in our bodies. That we all agree on. Atoms are made of particles, and we know what those particles are. There's protons, there's neutrons, there's electrons, and there's forces pushing them around, right? There's electromagnetism, gravity, there's nuclear forces. So the dramatic claim that I want to make, that rarely gets articulated as well as it should, is that layer, that language we have of talking about what's happening in this room right now, where it's particles interacting through the elementary forces of nature, we have that done. We have that figured out. We discovered the Higgs boson in 2012. You can argue whether or not we needed to discover that to count for this claim that I'm making, but it's true. We know all of the particles that you are made of. And not only by that do I mean that we've already discovered the particles we know are in you and me and the table and the floor, and for that matter, the sun, the moon, and the stars, but we are convinced we will never, ever, ever discover new particles that are relevant to what is happening in this room right now. And I'm saying that in very, very careful language because, of course, we hope we will discover some kinds of new particles. We discovered the Higgs in 2012. We discovered the top quark in the late 1990s. Particle physicists like to discover new things. That's what they do for a living. We think that there is at least one particle that we haven't discovered yet, which makes up the dark matter, which is most of the matter in the universe. What I'm trying to argue is that even when we discover the dark matter, it will not be relevant to understanding the physics of you and me, to understand what we are and how we behave. The secret to our biology, our life, our nature as organic beings, our thinking, our consciousness, is not going to be found in changing those laws of physics. We know what the particles are, the fields, the forces that hold them together, and we know how they behave. And of course, don't take my word for it. I'm sure you haven't. I don't need to tell you that. There are reasons why we think this. And again, it's not just that we've found some particles and we're pretty sure we're done. That would be very, very lazy, sloppy thinking if that were true. There's something very, very interesting and powerful about the way we think about this particular way of talking about nature, the way we think about talking about these particles and these forces. And there is a whole thing, how long do I have to talk? You said 3 hours? There's a whole thing called quantum field theory, which Marcelo alluded to, a way of thinking about how these particles interact that really puts very, very stringent constraints on what they can do. So here's how these constraints work. Imagine there was some particle that was really important for breathing. Okay, no one believes that's true, but just to take an anodyne example, imagine there was some new force of nature or some new elementary particle that was really crucial to understanding how we breathed, right? So you could say, well, what I'm proposing is that there is some particle and there's some number of those particles in our bodies and it helps with our respiration. What does that mean? That means that the particle exists and it means that it interacts with the particles that we are made of in a noticeable way, right? So the feature of quantum field theory is that if there exists a particle that interacts with us, then we can make it. We can create every particle that we interact with. How? By smashing other particles together, right? When we found that Higgs boson in 2012, how did we find it? We smashed together protons with each other, and we created Higgs bosons. It's not that the Higgs boson was locked inside the proton. The Higgs boson is over 100 times heavier than a proton is. But we smash these protons together with so much force that when we say particles in physics, what we really mean are vibrations in these quantum fields. And the vibrations in these fields overlapped and went crazy and started all the other fields in the universe vibrating. And one of those was a little Higgs boson, which we were able to detect. To be fair, we actually did not detect the Higgs boson. We detect the things that the Higgs boson decays into, okay? The Higgs boson decays away in about 1 zeptosecond, which is a very short period of time. And we will never see a Higgs boson. It just decays away like that. And it's very hard to make. And we've smashed enough particles together in enough different ways to say with confidence that if there are other particles out there, which surely there are, then either they decay away as soon as you make them, or they interact with us so weakly that we can't make them. That's what we think is the case with the dark matter. It's very heavy, very hard to make, and there's probably dark matter particles going through this room right now. But they go right through you. They don't interact with you. They will therefore not be important for explaining how you breathe or how you live or how you think. So there's this one layer, which Nobel laureate Frank Wilczek has called the core theory, the theory that takes into account these elementary particles and the forces of nature, including gravity and electromagnetism and so forth. And my claim is that we understand that one layer. That doesn't mean we understand the bottom layer of reality, okay? There could be layers underneath. I'm pretty sure there are. I'm pretty sure we don't understand the nature of space and time themselves. That's okay. We don't understand the layers on top of the elementary particles. We don't understand chemistry, biology, sociology, politics, my goodness, we don't understand very well at all. That's also okay. We don't even understand the layer sideways from the elementary particles that we know and love. We don't understand the dark matter and other astrophysical phenomena. So that it's actually a very grandiose, bombastic-sounding claim that when you really think about it carefully is quite restricted in what we're saying. We understand certain elementary particles in a certain regime of what they can possibly do. It's just that that regime includes everything that you and I ever do, and everything that we see around us in our everyday lives. So the way that I say it is, the laws of physics underlying our everyday lives are completely known. Again, that doesn't mean we understand all the emergent layers on top, and in fact, there's a lot to learn when you talk about elementary particles ganging up to make complex, emergent phenomena macroscopically like you and me. If you meet someone, if you have a date with someone, you go on a blind date, you never met this person, you're talking to them, and they say, well, tell me about yourself. You would not start listing all of your atoms and say, well, this atom does this, and this atom does that. I mean, if you were an undergraduate at Caltech, that might be kind of sexy, but for most of us, we tell a story that is at a much higher level than that, and we don't know the ultimate theory of reality at those higher levels. In exactly the same way that I don't know how to talk about the integrated circuit and the programming in my iPhone. But they're both based on these particles that we've made as physicists and what they do. There are really important implications of this fact that the laws of physics underlying our everyday lives are completely known. One is that you cannot bend the spoons with your mind. Okay, you cannot hold up, you may have seen people claim to do this, hold up a spoon, just look at it, and it bends just by the force of you thinking about it. You can't do that. Sorry. I can't name names because the litigation always follows. But the idea that there is a force that I can focus with my brain that somehow bends the spoon, well, look, I know what all the forces could be. I know what all the particles are that make up my brain and all the particles are that make up the spoon. And I know there's none that can reach over there and bend the spoon. Most people are happy with that. It also means that there's no life after death. That's where people sort of get off the bus and stop listening to me. But I think it's true. So this is my belief, and I'm giving you the arguments why I believe it. Because we know what you are. We know the stuff that makes you up. We don't know how that stuff comes together to make you who you are in the personal sense, but we know that the stuff that makes you up, we know all of it, and we know that when you die, it's still there. It doesn't go anywhere. There's no way for the information that makes you you, the memories that you have, the personality traits, all those charming little quirks that make you you. There's no way for that to go anywhere because we know what you're made of. And what that means is that, so some people take this fact about what we understand about the world as disenchanting, or it's not romantic, or it makes them sad because they think that something is lacking. It seems very clinical and dry, and only a physicist could love this world where we're all made of particles obeying the laws of physics. I can even write down the equation, and in fact, you can buy T-shirts with the equation on it that govern all of the particles and fields inside you. Is it somehow less of a lovable universe when you live in a universe for which that part of reality is described in that way? So I don't think so. I think that the ramifications of this way of thinking are enormous, and if anything, we don't take them seriously enough, but I don't think that it's dispiriting in any way. And the reason why I like to dwell on the life after death thing is because that's where it really gets us the closest, right, in our hearts. That's what we have trouble accepting very often. You can go through the math. It's a fun thing to do. It turns out that all different kinds of mammals here on Earth live for the same number of heartbeats. If you're a more massive animal, if you're like an elephant or a whale, you live longer, but your heart beats more slowly. If you're a tiny little mouse or a rodent, you live for shorter, but your heart beats faster. It exactly cancels. All the mammals on Earth live for about 1.5 billion heartbeats. We human beings, if you do the math for your heart rate, that works out to about 35 or 40 years, which is more or less how long we lived in the state of nature. But now we have Obamacare for a little while. Now we live for 70 or 80 years. So the average human being gets 3 billion heartbeats. And if you believe the story I'm telling you about what you are made of and the fact that we know what happens to that stuff when you die, then those are all you get, 3 billion heartbeats. And of course, I'm not saying anything different than saying the average human being lives for 70 or 80 years, but putting it in terms of heartbeats, I think, evokes a certain feeling, because years take a long time to go by, and heartbeats, look, you've squandered several thousand heartbeats just since you sat here, okay? 3 billion is a big number, but it's not that big. To think that we only have 3 billion heartbeats and we're squandering them roughly once a second, and that's all we're going to get, I don't find that saddening or dispiriting at all. I think it's a challenge. I think it's liberating. It really focuses the mind, right? It's not a dress rehearsal, this life that we're living here. We have a certain amount of it, and every heartbeat counts. And the electrons and the particles that I'm made of, they're going to follow their equations. That's what they're going to do. But the fact that I, as a macroscopic person, have feelings and thoughts and choices, that doesn't go away. Any more than the fact that I can talk to Siri goes away because I know that the phone is made of those particles. I have the ability to make choices. I have the ability to make something of my life. We human beings have deployed that ability to understand this universe that we're in, to understand a lot about elementary particles, a tiny bit about chemistry, almost nothing about politics. What that means is there's plenty of room to do more things. We're nowhere near understanding all of the nature of reality, but we understand a little bit. That's an amazing intellectual accomplishment, and I'm very fascinated to see what the things are that we're going to learn next. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Perfect, 20 minutes, right on.
Spot on.
Okay, Alan.
Good evening. In Sean Carroll's very provocative book, which I have read very carefully with 26 pages of single-space notes, so I feel I'm clairvoyant. I've seen into your mind. In speaking only metaphorically, of course, you quote the poet Muriel Rukeyser with a delightful phrase, "The universe is made of stories, not of atoms," from her marvelous poem, The Speed of Darkness. And Sean himself adds here, "The world is what exists and what happens, but we gain enormous insight by talking about it, telling its story in different ways." So we're on common ground, totally common ground, so far. We're not going to have a whole lot, but we'll have some. And this is a good place to start, that there are multiple stories to be told and to listen to diverse ones that may be complementary, they may challenge our assumptions, is, I think, an inherently worthwhile thing to do. If we turn very briefly to Buddhism, and I'll come back and forth to it, in the Buddhist view, the defining characteristics of human beings, what makes us special or distinctive, is that we are able to understand meaningful information, and we're able to impart it as well. We're storytellers. In short, we are storytellers. Now, we tell many stories. We've heard a very good one here, based on a lot of science, but it is a story. And I would suggest that all the stories we tell ourselves, we tell each other about the physical universe, life, the mind, and so forth, we all, without exception, we begin with certain assumptions that we believe to be true, but we may not be able to prove within the context of our worldview. We start with assumptions, call them beliefs, axioms. On this basis, we develop theories. And then there is that which, throughout the course of our lives, we focus on, what we attend to. So if you're a physicist, a professional physicist, what will you be attending to in the laboratory, on campus, as a practice? You'll be going to be attending to physical things. And what we attend to, this is coming from William James, one of my intellectual heroes, what we attend to is that which we wind up taking to be real, and that which we don't attend to fades out. It seems more epiphenomenal or simply a way of talking. But the whole theme of underlying, which I heard many times in this very succinct talk from Sean, what underlies what? What are our starting assumptions? What are we attending to? What kinds of questions are we proposing to nature? And how do we seek to get the answers to them? So I'm going to summarize very briefly what I heard Sean describe, but this is directly from his quote, from his own book. There's only one world, the natural world, exhibiting patterns we call the laws of nature, and which is discoverable by the methods of science and empirical investigation. There is no separate realm of the supernatural, spiritual, or divine, nor is there any cosmic teleology or transcendent purpose inherent in the nature of the universe or in human life. Life, consciousness, do not denote essences distinct from matter. They are ways of talking about phenomena that emerge from the interplay of extraordinarily complex systems. This is the kind of statement one would expect from a physicist, which is good. This is one of the stories. What I'm suggesting, of course, is not the only story. And the notion of what underlies what is more fundamental, is crucial. And it does have to do with starting assumptions, what we're attending to, and how we attend, how we pose questions, how we seek solutions. So as I was reading through Sean's book, I found 3 assumptions, axioms, that I never saw questioned. And that is determinism, and that is the future uniquely follows from the present. Realism, there's a real world out there independent of any observer. It's really out there and it can be known. And then physicalism, everything that exists is physical. Again, something one might expect from a physicist, but probably not from a poet or from a contemplative, for example. But it's a good story, and it's proven useful in many ways. But I would like to enter into the spirit of what Sean himself has expressed and what Marcelo has expressed also. Let's look at other stories. So here's a story now from Roger Penrose, but it traces back to the Pythagoreans, back to Plato, and that is looking at nature and the laws of nature and seeing how precisely mathematical they are, extraordinarily mathematical. Why should that be the case? Why not just more or less mathematical, or maybe not mathematical at all? And going back to Pythagoras, this is 2,500 years, there have been philosophers and contemporary scientists, top-notch ones, that have posited maybe the underlying reality is not physical at all. It's not particles, it's forces. Maybe it's a dimension of reality that's pure mathematics. And out of that emerges this world that we are experiencing as physical, the world of nature. In which case, mathematicians first-rate, like Roger Penrose, who I know Sean himself tremendously admires, as do I, he says mathematicians don't just start out with axioms and then do logical deductions. They're actually exploring a realm of reality that's pure math. They make discoveries, they intersubjectively validate discoveries of a deeper underlying realm of reality that's mathematics, mathematical in nature. Werner Heisenberg, one of the great pioneers of quantum mechanics, said, with regard to this question, modern physics, the question is, does it boil down to elementary particles and forces, or does it boil down to pure math, geometrical forms, numbers? And Werner Heisenberg says, with regard to this question, modern physics takes a definite stand against materialism of Democritus and for Plato and the Pythagoreans. It's another story. That mathematics is actually the primary science. That's what's getting at what's really underlying. But then physicists and others have also noticed something quite remarkable about this universe we're experiencing, and that is the constants of nature. It turns out that there's a set of fundamental physical constants throughout the universe that are such that had they been even slightly different, the universe would have been void of intelligent life. Now, this has led some very good physicists, such as John Barrow, Frank Tipler, and others, to suggest, as they say, and I quote, there exists one possible universe designed with the goal of generating and sustaining observers. In other words, this universe is life-friendly. It's not an accident that there may be something like a life force, or a theist might say God, that created this universe in order to bring forth, as a house, a container, to bring forth intelligent life. In which case, biology would be the fundamental science, not particles and forces of physics, but biology would be the underlying reality. But now there are others, going back to Max Planck, the founder of quantum mechanics, Einstein, we all know of, and they suggest maybe it's mind. Max Planck says, this mind is the matrix of all matter. We must assume there is a force, there is behind this force of atoms the existence of a conscious, intelligent mind. It's very unpopular nowadays in scientific circles to speak of intelligent design. And that's exactly what Max Planck was asserting, that maybe there's a superior mind. Or Einstein himself says there is a superior mind that reveals itself in the world of experience, the God of Spinoza. So James Jeans, one of the great pioneers of cosmology in Great Britain, he wrote, the universe begins to look more like a giant thought than a great machine. Mind no longer appears to be an accidental intruder in the realm of matter. We ought rather hail it as the creator and governor of the realm of matter. So what underlies what? Maybe mind underlies, maybe a divine mind. These are by first-rate scientists. I'm not choosing any flakes here. This would be another underlying idea. But now, a person that I know, at least Sean and I know personally, a marvelous scientist by the name of Anton Zeilinger, he, drawing on the work of John Wheeler, relating to work of Stephen Hawking, he suggests, it's a long quote, but it's pretty juicy, so allow me if you will. He's suggesting something else is underlying, not particles and forces, something deeper. He says, one may be tempted to assume that whenever we ask questions of nature, of the world there outside, there is reality existing independently of what can be said about it. This is an unquestioned assumption in Sean Carroll's book. He said, we may be tempted to. We, Anton Zeilinger, John Wheeler, and others will say, we now claim that such a position is void of any meaning. It's not even wrong. It just doesn't mean anything. It is obvious that any property or feature of reality out there, so to speak, can only be based on information we receive. There cannot be any statement whatsoever about the world or about reality that is not based on such information. It therefore follows that the concept of reality, without at least the ability in principle to make statements about it, to obtain information about its features, is devoid of any possibility of confirmation or proof. This implies that the distinction between information, that is knowledge, and reality is devoid of meaning. Evidently, what we are talking about is, again, a unification of very different concepts. The reader might recall that unification is one of the main themes of the development of modern science. So John Wheeler really unpacks this in a tremendously interesting, provocative way, that information, semantic information, meaningful information, is fundamental, underlying, and out of our concepts of information, we create the constructs of particles, forces, space, time, matter, subject, object, mind, and matter, and so on. Information is underlying, information is primary. It's a different view. But then there's another theoretical physicist, first rate, right up here at Stanford, André Linde. He suggests another possibility of what's underlying. He writes, and I quote him, the current scientific model of the material world obeying laws of physics, which Sean has just described, has been so successful that we forget about our starting point as conscious observers and conclude that matter is the only reality and that perceptions are only helpful for describing it. But in fact, we are substituting the reality of our experience of the universe with a conceptually contrived belief in an independently existent material world. And he poses a question, a heretical question perhaps, and that is it possible that consciousness, like space-time, has its own intrinsic degrees of freedom, and that neglecting these will lead to a description of the universe that is fundamentally incomplete? So the core theory may be incomplete after all because something's left out, and that's consciousness. We have not understood it. What if our perceptions, he continues, are as real, or maybe in a certain sense are even more real than material objects? What if consciousness is more real, more fundamental, more underlying than particles and forces? This is, again, not by some mystic or hippie, as much as I like hippies, but a first-rate cosmologist. I'm sure Sean knows him personally. But then there's another view. And again, I'm citing only top-notch physicists. Freeman Dyson, he writes, "I'm reluctant to engage in discussions about the meaning of quantum theory because I find that the experts in this area have a tendency to speak with dogmatic certainty, each of them convinced that one particular solution to the problem has a unique claim to be the final truth. As a physicist, I am much more impressed by our ignorance than by our knowledge." In that theme, I will quote my two colleagues right here. Sean Carroll, "Quantum mechanics is the deepest and most fundamental picture of the world we now have, but what it says about reality is utterly uncertain." But he's certainly certain that it's the best show in town. He's a physicist. And Marcelo Gleiser, "We are essentially," and I quote, "we are essentially blind to what exists at the very core of physical reality. All we have is our measurements, and they give an incomplete picture of what's really going on." So, I was invited here as a Buddhist scholar, contemplative teacher, whatever. So now we turn to Buddhism. And especially the segue from Marcelo's comment here, that we are essentially blind to what exists at the very core of physical reality. There's a very famous parable that the Buddha taught. You probably heard it, many of you. The parable of the blind men and the elephant. And it is attributed to the Buddha. Maybe somebody said it before him. But there was a king, a Raja, and he gathered together a group of blind men, and he presented them with an elephant. And the men respectively, I'll just paraphrase the parable, they respectively touched the head, ear, tusk, trunk, the side of the body, a foot, the back, the tail, the tuft of the tail, and then respectively, as each of them described the elephant, they described it as a pot, a winnowing basket, a plowshare, a plow, a granary, a pillar, a mortal, a pestle, and a brush. In other words, very, very different, incompatible descriptions. Not wrong, but incompatible. And each one was certain that he had right, because he's reporting on what he experienced. Then they began to quarrel, shouting, "Yes, it is. No, it is not. An elephant is not that. Yes, it's like that." And so on, till they came to blows over the matter. You notice that nobody's fighting here. It's really wonderful.
Not yet.
Not yet. But what we've heard, everybody I cited there, all of those individuals, they are all 20th century, first-rate physicists, cosmologists, mathematicians, and so forth. So the Buddha commented here, just so are these teachers and scholars holding their various views blind and unseeing. In their ignorance, they are by nature quarrelsome, wrangling, and disputatious, each maintaining reality is thus and thus. And what they're really getting at is, if we put this in the 21st century, what's the underlying nature of reality? Is physics, is modern science, is it compatible with belief in a continuity of consciousness after death, in the supernatural, and so forth? And even among physicists, there are those who would disagree. Now, I'm an academic somewhat, as I used to be. I escaped some years ago. But there's a lot of emphasis nowadays on developing secular Buddhism. And I'd like to suggest that the first secular Buddhist was the Buddha. And I'll give you my empirical evidence for this, and I quote him. He's coming to a village where a lot of people, villagers have heard a lot of people propounding the truth and the completely incompatible, and each one saying, I got it right, and they're doing exactly that. And so they were very skeptical. And so the Buddha addresses them and said, it's proper for you to doubt, to be uncertain, for there are good grounds for your uncertainty. Do not adopt views simply because they are the status quo, or because they've long been assumed to be true. Do not accept them based on mere rumor, or because they're written in some scripture. Do not accept them based on pure conjecture, some unquestioned assumption, inconclusive reasoning, your own personal bias or others' eloquence, or because it's the view of your teacher. This is very healthy skepticism, I think. And then he said, well, what shall we do? He said, test it for yourself. He was truly an empiricist. And so we come back to the stories. And I can say among all the people I cited, they were all white, male, 20th century, mainstream, reputable, or perhaps even eminent physicists. But what I've noted in my reading over the last, especially the 25 years or so since I was a student at Amherst, 30 years, was that so much of this discourse suggests a blindness in modern science generally. I'm not pointing fingers at this person or that person, just a generalization, see whether it's true. Blind to any possible insights into the fundamental nature of reality, what is the underlying nature of reality, from any of the great civilizations of Asia over the past 5,000 years, China, Japan, India, Southeast Asia, Tibet. Where do we ever hear any references? Did those people there in Asia discover anything that might be relevant for 5,000 years? And it basically doesn't come up. Let alone indigenous cultures all over North and South America, Africa, Australia, and so forth. In other words, this is a very narrow sliver of humanity that seems to regard itself as the center of the universe. So questions come up, we hear them, that is there intelligent life elsewhere in the universe? And the answer is yeah, Asia. I mean, it's really been overlooked. In the 19th century, we understand that, but now in the 21st century, to ignore whole civilizations, there's blind on one point, because my time's running out too. Blind in another way. We have these marvelous array, diverse branches of modern science, and for every one, it's characterized by developing sophisticated, rigorous, precise modes of measurement, of observation of that which you're seeking to understand. Right? There's one exception. You know what that is? Mind. Behaviorists study the mind indirectly by studying behavior. Brain scientists study the brain correlates of mind, but not in psychology, not in cognitive neuroscience. Where is there in mainstream academia any rigorous training in observing the only mind you have any direct access to? Where? And I've been looking and I'm not finding. We haven't done it. We study things that related to mind, but we're not looking at it in a rigorous, sophisticated way. This is what Asia has been good at for 5,000 years, the Buddhist tradition for 2,500. Highly developed, sophisticated ways of training, first of all, attention, which we in the modern world suck at. I mean, we're getting worse. We're slipping into a trough of ADHD from which we may never extricate ourselves. And then not only developing attention skills, which has got to be good, and they're extremely good at it. We've hardly even aware that it's taking place there for 2,500 years, longer in the Hindu tradition. But then developing and refining metacognitive ability to observe thoughts, to explore multiple dimensions, layers of consciousness. There's a whole world here that we're not attending to, therefore it seems to be just a way of talking about the brain. It's not. And I can demonstrate that, and it's going to take 10 seconds. For 10 seconds, I'm going to ask you to do something very simple. Mentally be totally silent. Don't move, don't behave, and just be aware of what's coming to mind. 10 seconds. I would say with tremendous confidence what you just experienced was not a way of talking about the brain, because you weren't talking. It's not a way of behaving, because they're not behaving. It's underlying. It is that which comes before the talking and the behaving, deliberate conscious behaving. We've been overlooking something, pretending as if the mind-body problem is solved. It's not. We've just talked our way out of it as if we know. The measurement problem in quantum mechanics has not been solved. It's 90 years now, no progress. Mind-body problem, no progress. In 130 years, we've been overlooking something, and it's exactly the weakness here of modern science that we've overlooked the nature of the observer. We're not taking a scientific approach to the nature of observer. We've left out something, and that's us. The nature of the mind, consciousness itself. We are more ignorant about consciousness than we are distant galaxies that formed 10 billion years ago, more ignorant about consciousness than we are about the inner nucleus of an atom. Why? Because we're not looking. This is what Buddhism brings to the table. Not a dogma, not please believe this or please believe that. Methods of rigorous, refined, first-person inquiry into mind to complement the glories, the magnificent accomplishments of objective science, which is the strength of the West. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. Okay, so the way this goes now is I will invite you to, yes, I'm the referee on my left. So basically, if you have a response, since you spoke first, if you have a response, well, and then Alan, if you have a response, and then I can interfere if I have to.
I mean, I think what's important here is that Alan bought my book. I do appreciate it. Thank you for that.
And I read it.
And you read it.
And read it.
Less important that you read it, you bought it, your work here is done, as far as I'm concerned. But, yeah, I mean, too many things to say, obviously. We could have hours and hours of discussion. So rather than actually, maybe this is okay, rather than asking a question, all right, let me ask one quick question.
Sure.
What is the difference between mind and individual minds? When you were talking about mind and the centrality of mind, do we have in mind something singular and monistic and cosmic, or are we thinking about each one of us has one of these minds?
Well, when I posited that as one of the stories, it was from Max Planck, Einstein, and Sir James Jeans. They're talking about a cosmic mind. There's no question. Yeah, not me. That's not where, I'm a Buddhist, been Buddhist for 45 years. That's not where we start. We don't start with a leap of faith, or please believe in Nirvana, or Buddha, or something like that. We start where we are, and that is, and I would suggest it's the most indubitable, his hypothesis. The most indubitable knowledge that I have is consciousness is happening. I won't even put in a personal pronoun. But consciousness is happening, appearances to consciousness are happening. That's where we start. So no allusion to cosmic mind, inconceivable mind. How about we're conscious, and what's up with that?
Good. Excellent. So let me make 2 quick points, and I think Alan can respond at any length. So the 2 quick points. So I disagree that consciousness and the mind are central, but that's great. I mean, that's why we're here. We knew ahead of time this would happen. And you can agree or disagree with one of us or both of us, and that's also fine. We're trying to give each other things to think about. We're not trying to actually... I think this is not the last time we get to talk about the nature of reality in human history. So
maybe not.
We'll go on from there. So let me just put forward 2 ideas that help you understand why I don't think that mind is separate in addition to your brain and the particles and forces that make up your brain. One is that it seems to me to be like the last gasp of anti-Copernicanism, right? Copernicus, many years ago, made a lot of money by saying maybe the Earth is not the center of the solar system, maybe we're displaced. Traditionally, not always, but in traditional ancient cosmologies, the Earth had a privileged role. It was either at the center or it was doing something important, and Copernicus said, well, maybe it's off to the side, and Kepler said maybe there are ellipses, and Galileo actually showed that there were things orbiting around Jupiter, not just around the Earth. And ever since then, there in the history of science have been a number of episodes in which our importance as people to the workings of the grander cosmos has seemed to diminish. Even Copernicus thought that the sun was special, right? But now we know there's lots of stars out there. It wasn't until it was the 1920s that we knew there were other galaxies in the universe. Darwin showed that the existence of life and the origin of us as human beings is not special. It's continuous with the physical processes here on Earth. So to me, when I look at one of these images that you can see online, or you get big posters of what is called the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. right? This is an image of galaxies. This is the picture you would get if you went out on a clear night with your camera, you point it at a blank spot on the sky, you click the shutter, and if your camera is attached to the Hubble Space Telescope, you will see that even the blankest parts of the skies are alive with galaxies. There are 2 trillion galaxies in our observable universe, is our best current estimate. On average, 100 billion stars per galaxy. And who knows what's beyond the observable universe? Perhaps a lot more. And to look at all that stuff, and this is a very cheap, tawdry argument, I'm sorry for even giving it, but it is very visceral, to look at all that and go, oh yes, consciousness must be central to this, just seems very backwards to me. Consciousness is the tiniest sliver of an imperceptible little speck on one little thing in a big, big collection of things. So that's hard for me to buy. That's point 1. Point 2 will be much faster. There's a chapter in my book, my favorite chapter, about Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. She is a person who would be like a world-famous philosopher or scientist, but in the 1600s, if you're female, you don't get to be a world-famous philosopher. But she did engage in a conversation with René Descartes, and Descartes was, of course, trying to articulate this idea that mind was somehow separate from the body. And Elizabeth engaged him in correspondence back and forth, and frankly, she got the better of him. He was a little snotty at first. He didn't think that a princess was really up to his level, but she kind of schooled him pretty badly. And her basic argument was, how in the world can you explain how this immaterial, disembodied, non-located thing you're calling a mind ever affect my body, ever push it around? Where does that happen? Show me where it actually happens. Because we know we have bodies. Whether or not the mind is separate from them, we know we have bodies. The modern version of this is we know we have particles in us. We know we have atoms. And we know what they do. We know how they behave. We know an equation that says if you put them in a certain situation, here's what's going to happen next. There's no room in that equation for consciousness or the mind to come in and go, oh, well, if this electron is in a mind, then it moves that way. It's completely possible that there should be. That is, as scientists, we're very open. Like, I could totally be wrong about everything I told you. If new evidence or argumentation comes that shows us that there's a better way of understanding the world in which that's the case, then we will change our minds, whether they're atoms or something else. But the point is, it's really hard to imagine, given what we know about the stuff that is in our brains, that there is anything else pushing it around. Does that stuff conserve energy? Is it predictable? Is it deterministic? Does it obey Schrödinger's equation? Does it have a location in space? I mean, there might be answers to all these questions, but there's also an easier answer, which is that there isn't any such stuff. The mind is hard to understand because it's the most complicated thing we know. Of course it's hard to understand. That doesn't seem to me to mean that we need to invoke new stuff outside the laws of physics.
Okay, thank you.
New stuff. Consciousness is not new stuff. Whatever it is not new. It's not new age. It's not new. It's been here long before scientists started thinking about it. It's a blind spot in the scientific view. It's really like mind doesn't matter because it's not matter, or it matters only if it is matter. You got that one, yeah? There's no evidence at all that, in fact, consciousness is matter. There is no evidence at all that mind is equivalent to the corresponding brain states. It's called the mind-body problem, and it's not been solved. You don't talk it out of existence by just saying mind is a way of talking about the brain, because it's evidently not. Consciousness is not a way of talking at all. Right? Love for a wife, for a friend, for a teacher, for humanity is not a way of talking. There is no scientific definition of consciousness, or there are 250, which is the same thing. There's no way of measuring it objectively in anything. We don't know scientifically what are the causal conditions that give rise to consciousness. Are plants consciousness? Are elementary particles consciousness? The answer is we don't know scientifically. We don't know what are the conditions that give rise to it, and therefore it is mere hubris to say that, well, we don't know where it comes from, but we certainly know that it terminates at death. No, you don't. The historian Daniel Boorstin said the greatest obstacle to scientific discovery is the illusion of knowledge, not ignorance. The scientific community has a lot of illusions of knowledge about consciousness. As if, well, after all, it's simply get sufficiently complex array of neurons together and then consciousness pops up. Thomas Huxley, the originator of kind of the church to which I think Sean belongs, called the Church of Scientific Materialism, said that the notion that consciousness or thoughts emerge from chemicals and electricity, and let's not mystify the brain, it's chemicals and electricity in very complex arrays, is just like believing that a genie comes out of a lamp. It's magical thinking, really. Love is not a way of talking about neurons. Love, you understand it by loving, not by knowing about neurons. One is not reducible to another. Only a robot would think that one is reducible to the other because a robot doesn't have any subjective experience. So this view that mind, well, since we can't explain it in terms of physics, therefore it must be nothing other than the brain, is a way of avoiding the problem rather than hitting it on face on. Sean's view here is determinism, which is to say that every time you feel you're making a choice, in fact, what's happening is simply what needed to happen because of the configuration of physical phenomena and the laws of nature. In other words, you could not have acted differently. That's determinism. It's Laplacian determinism. If you feel comfortable with that, I would suggest you go back to the novelist Isaac Bashevis Singer, who said, when he was asked, "Do you believe in free will?" And he said, "Yeah, of course. Do I have any choice?" We have to be taking first-person experience far more seriously, and we haven't. Because for about the last century, since John Watson, the rise of behaviorism, and the snuffing out of the radical empiricism of William James, we've been looking at behavior, we've been looking at brain. That's great. But we're missing the main event, a rigorous scientific way of observing the mind. So I'm not here to promote some Buddhist worldview or a set of beliefs. I'm not here to promote the notion mind is separate from matter. But I am saying that our scientific way of addressing the mind now is not scientific. Not in the way that geology, particle physics, astronomy, and so forth, where you rigorously observe the phenomena you're trying to seek. Introspection plays almost no role, and refined, developed introspection plays no role whatsoever in the modern scientific study of the mind. We're missing something here. And that's because the dogma of materialism, of physicalism, is saying, well, if you skip the first-person perspective, skip introspection, what have you missed after all? This is not a matter of Earth is in the center of the universe. It's rather suggesting that throughout the entire universe, there may be conscious beings. The Buddhist view is not the Abrahamic. In the Buddhist view, planet Earth is not the center of the universe. This, in the Buddhist view, is one in a cluster of 100 billion inhabited world systems. And that's only one cluster. And there are many, many clusters of 100 billion-fold inhabited world systems throughout space. So we have to get off the notion that Western religion is the only religion. I don't even think of Buddhism as a religion. It's a radically empirical way to investigate the nature of reality from the inside out. Investigate the mind from the inside with an open mind and see what flows. So I'm not here to argue mind-body dualism or any other dualisms. That's just a way of talking. But rather to adopt a radically empirical, truly scientific approach to observing the mind and not just talking it out of existence by saying it's just a way of talking about neurons. I don't buy that.
Good. So we're approaching the end, and I want to give you some time to ask questions to the speakers. Let me just say one thing that I think if there is something we can learn from tonight's conversation is that being a human is both exhilarating and perplexing, right? We, at least hopefully, we really enjoy the ability that we have to ask fundamental questions about existence. And I would slightly disagree with Sean in being a little anti-Copernican by saying that there is a distinction that makes us human a little special just because we are here and we are asking all these questions, so.
Well, you're a human, but I'm a robot, because I think the love comes down to neurons. So.
Well, okay. I didn't know they could do this machine learning so well, but I guess they can. That's awesome. So in that sense, I think that it's kind of a privilege to be able to be asking these questions and to be able to reflect about all this. This issue of the binding problem, that is how something immaterial interact with something material, is extremely complex, right? And what Sean basically is saying is that we have zero evidence that there is anything there, right? Meaning there are no forces. You could make similar arguments to the issue of supernatural. Like if you go and you say, I've seen a ghost, and you could say, well, you've seen the ghost, so the ghost is an electromagnetic manifestation. So it's a perfectly real thing that you can understand through normal physics. So at the moment that what is immaterial interacts with the material, what is supernatural interacts with the natural, it becomes part of nature. And hence should be understood within that context. The fact that we don't have all the tools, and I think we all agree, that we really don't understand consciousness. I mean, anybody that says that they do, they're crazy, because they don't. Nobody does, right? I mean, there is a group of philosophers which are called the Mysterians. I love that name, which basically posit the point, which is called the hard problem of consciousness, which basically says that we are not equipped to understand the nature of consciousness because we are so much within our own narrative, locked within our own minds, that to understand consciousness as an objective object of study, like an electron is just not possible, and that makes the whole idea complicated, right? I mean, not to say perhaps impossible for us to understand. Maybe a robot, very smart robot, maybe it'll come from the Bay Area, who knows, right? Or some very sophisticated alien will be able to do that one day, but right now we are very confused by the whole idea. And so the nature of reality is also a very confusing topic because, as Sean was saying from the beginning, there are all these different layers and complementary ways of knowing. So I think, if anything, tonight, what we've learned is that we have to look at all these different points of view with a huge dose of humility, because clearly we don't understand all there is to understand. We don't even know the questions we should be asking to understand everything, right? And that is part of knowledge, is to be ignorant. I mean, that's exactly what makes us want to ask questions, is because we do not know. So we should just celebrate the not knowing and stay curious about what we can understand about who we are. All right, thank you so much. And now we have questions from the audience. And now we should be able to see you if we squint.
This first question is
Yes.
far to your right at the front.
Hi there. So this is a question about the heartbeat that you brought up, Sean. And so we know that the heartbeat starts at the sinoatrial node, right? It's this electrical impulse that starts the heart, right? I just want to, I am not a scientist, I know that much. And in order for so then that happens, the heart pumps out oxygen to the body, including the brain. I asked an electrophysiologist, how does the heart know to cause an electrical impulse to start the heart going? And she just said, oh, well, it just does. That's how it's built. So I just wanted to throw that out as a question of how does the heart know, and does the mind tell the heart? Does the heart just somehow have this intrinsically? It seems like since it's electricity, it's in your field.
Right, clearly you want a cosmologist to answer this question. I can see why that would make sense. I think, for one thing, we shouldn't use the vocabulary, how does the heart know, right? That's just like saying if I drop the glass, how does it know to go down? Attributing knowledge to the glass is probably not the right way of getting the best explanation for that phenomenon. But as far as I know, it is the intrinsic state of the musculature of the heart that says, all right, it's been about a second, I should beat again. I don't think it's a signal from the brain, but if there's anyone who actually knows, they should answer the question, because I'm a physicist. Also, by the way, you can Google that, and I...
They probably are.
This question is up in the center of the balcony.
Hi. So I'm a behavioral neurologist, and so I see a lot of patients at the interface of how problems in the actual matter of the brain affect the mind and their behavior. And I'm just wondering how that comes into the equation of that discussion. I mean, it seems like we are arguing that mind is something that's separate from brain matter, and yet we see these very horrible and sad stories every day of people who get a little stroke somewhere or a little degenerative illness somewhere else, and they become a totally different person with a totally set of behaviors and personality, etc. So how, I'm just trying to sort of understand how do that factor into that theory of the mind and the brain. And also my second question is that I was thinking about, I mean, we heard a lot about the methods that science is using in the West are different from the ones in the East, which is great. But I also would like to hear sort of what are the conclusions that came out of that quote-unquote research that is being done from the internal work as opposed to observation or scientific methods.
I've been asked to respond. And yes, first of all, this discussion that I've been listening to has not been a discussion, does the mind exist separately from the brain or not? I never argued one way or another. My argument was not, this is what the Buddhists believe, this is a Buddhist worldview, talk about reincarnation. That's not why I came. But rather that we treat the mind as being as natural as anything else in the universe, and therefore if you want to understand it, observe it, and don't just glance at it, but actually develop the appropriate technology for exploring empirically, experientially, the mind in all the depth possible. And then let your assumptions fall away as they do. And so what is clearly true, but which has been known for hundreds of years, that when people, 5,000 years ago got kicked in the head by a horse, they might not be so smart afterwards, they get kicked in the butt, probably it's okay. And so clearly the mind and brain are correlated. There's strong correlations, but correlation does not mean equivalence, not in any system of logic I've ever heard. But the point here is not to argue, oh no, please believe in reincarnation or what have you, but just to acknowledge how ignorant we are, that there has been actually no progress at all solving the hard problem. How do the mind and brain interrelate? You don't talk the problem away just by saying one is the way of talking about the other. That's just an opinion. Now, Marcelo made a comment that I've heard many times, acknowledging we don't understand the nature of consciousness. So it's agnosticism, right? That's humility, it's good. But then he went a bit further. No one does. That, as a person who's lived in Asia for, many years, at least seems like you're moving from agnosticism to omniscience. Nobody knows. If they tell you that you do, they don't know what they're talking about. How do we know what everybody else knows? We've ignored Asia for the whole history of science. Did anybody in Asia come up with anything in the last 5,000 years about the nature of mind and consciousness? They're using different methods that we have not used. And scientists are using methods they have not used. So I'm not here to argue one is better than another, but I am suggesting that it's more hubris to say nobody knows about consciousness because we don't. We white people, we Eurocentric people. The age of colonialism should be over by now. But the remnants of that is if we don't know, nobody knows. I'm not persuaded that's true. Maybe, in fact, I am quite confident there are people outside of our own culture. I've lived with Tibetans for 14 years that have very deep insight in the nature of consciousness. They didn't get there by just believing this or that or having great faith in the Buddha, but by doing what scientists do, with an open mind, rigorously investigating the phenomena itself and seeing what comes up, but not having ideological blockages to say that evidence can't be true because that doesn't conform to my core theory. It's too much. So to be truly open in the 21st century, I think we have to be humble where we stand, but also humble about what other people do and do not know.
Okay, point well taken. More questions?
This question's at your left in the orchestra.
Hi, thanks for your guys' talk. Sean, I particularly like when you talked about the calling out the thing about people who believe there's no life after death. Like I have friends who are like, they're like some of the most joyful people I know. Like So like there's a unfair, I think, bias against that at points. But I'm curious, you have two pretty different views about things, and you had a civil and respectful, curious conversation with one another. I'm curious whether either of the two of you have ever or are deeply in love, or rationally in love, whatever, with someone who has the complete opposite worldview of you. It's like, how do you find affection when you know, oh, that person thinks there's life after death? Like, you know what I mean? I swear I wanted to ask like a really intelligent question, but like this is the one that kept coming. Because you're married. I can see you're married, Sean. And I was like, anyway, that's my question.
I love my mom very deeply. I will just leave it at that.
No debate.
That's great. I guess we just talk about it. Any more?
So next question.
Okay.
All right, look, I can talk about this. Let me talk about this. Yeah, loving people is important. I think that the fact that I love people is not evidence that we need to change the fundamental laws of physics as we currently know them. But I also don't think that our knowledge of the fundamental laws of physics invalidates the way that we have of talking about human beings as conscious agents who make choices, who have emotions, who have feelings, who have desires, who fall in love, any more than it invalidates the idea that I can talk about this chair as made of fabric and wood, even though I know it's made of atoms. If you've ever watched The Big Bang Theory, you know that knowing the laws of physics doesn't make you any better at social engagements or love or anything like that. Those guys get lucky a lot, it's true, but the reasons why you love someone, I think Alan and I will both agree, these are not things that are understood by modern science. Does Asian wisdom tell us how we fall in love with different people? I think that this is something that we all know a little bit about and none of us knows completely well.
That's another, whether nobody knows it pretty well, that's again, who knows what other people do or do not know. But I think that's another conference.
Yeah.
Too big a topic.
This question is at the back of the balcony.
Hey, I'm Sushmita, and this is a little more serious, but I'm curious to know what happens to consciousness when the brain dies or the body dies. Does consciousness just cease to exist, or is it conscious that something just happened and then it just disappears? And this is from your experience traveling the world and interacting with people. I'm curious to know.
You probably get very different answers.
Yeah. Would you like to direct it to Sean or to me or both?
I think you
What's your
should
choice?
both say
It's your
something
choice.
about this.
Go ahead, Alan, you go first.
Okay. The human mind, human states of consciousness, emotions, desires, the whole array of mental processes we experience, quite evidently arise in dependence upon the brain functioning. And as the brain is impaired, damaged through Alzheimer's, through brain injury, motorcycle accident, disease, and so forth, various faculties of sight, of memory, and so forth, as we well know, and we now know with much greater sophistication than ever before, the correlations between the two. That human mind that does clearly arise, and I'll choose my words very carefully, arises in dependence upon and is correlated to brain function, ceases to exist. If it's arising in dependence upon the brain and the brain ceases to function as a brain, then the support's gone. Now, if your awareness of the mind is, to be very blunt, superficial, you just have a casual kind of folk psychology awareness of what's going on in your mind, and Sean in his beautiful book emphasized the importance of self-awareness, that this is something important and could be refined. What I would suggest is the Buddhists have about a 2,500-year head start on us on that one. This does not advocate a doctrine or their conclusions, but let's let me report on something they found. And I offer it only as an empirical hypothesis that can be tested. What I found, because I've been studying Western theories, materialistic theories of mind for about 30 years now, what's interesting is I've not found one theory, and John knows perfectly well there's a lot of theories, property dualism, substitutalism, and so forth. There's some neuroscientists believe consciousness doesn't exist. There's a philosopher who believes that appearances don't exist. So there's really white, cockeyed theories out there. What I've noticed they all have in common is not a single one is empirically testable. They're just beliefs. What happens if you spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day probing into the nature of your mind from a first-person perspective, and your mind, with all of its human thoughts, perceptions, memories, and so forth, is calmed to the point of silence? You comment in your book, Sean, silence is possible, but your heart keeps on beating. Fine, but withdraw your awareness from your body. Withdraw it entirely into the mind, which happens when you're dreaming, when you're going to deep sleep. Let your mind shut down in terms of all of the explicit cognitive activity, emotional and so forth. And what has been discovered, and I'll just say has been discovered, is that you move beyond that whole dimension, which is the only dimension that modern science knows about, the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, that's it. You move beyond both of those. You penetrate through both of those to an underlying, now I'm going to use the word underlying continuum of consciousness that's purely mental, but it's not human. There's nothing human about it. It has no gender, no personal history. It's a simple continuum of cognizance, a flow of consciousness. And it, and not the brain, is the repository of memories. Now here's the hypothesis. I'm not asking anybody to believe this. Just as Sean said, you may not believe what I'm saying, so feel free to disagree. I'm saying something that is not simply conjecture or belief, but this is something that's been discovered and rediscovered hundreds and hundreds of times over the last 2,500 years and longer. Penetrate through your psyche to a deeper level of consciousness, an underlying level of consciousness that isn't even human. And that's the actual repository of memories. The brain is the keyboard, this underlying continuum is the hard drive, if we want to use the hackneyed computer analogy. Now that's said to be a discovery that's been replicated thousands of times. And they'll tell you exactly how you can put this to the test. And then, one way to put to the test is tap into that and see if you can retrieve memories from a previous life. Now, of course, you may come up with nothing, but very obviously, you may come up with sheer fantasy. I was Cleopatra. I was, whatever, all the goofy stuff. But what happens if you come up memories, and then somebody who's open-minded, skeptical, critical, but is open-minded said, let's see whether those memories are veridical or not, and whether you have any way of knowing that information about another person's life that seems to have the same continuum as your own. This is a theory that can be tested. And so my vision, my passion now, as I'm getting to be something of an old geezer, as I was telling Marcelo over dinner, is to create a contemplative scientific research facility where people are trained for 5, 10 years, rigorously, but with no dogma, no brainwashing, no indoctrination, radical empiricism to probe through, penetrate through this dimension of mind, which is clearly human, to deeper levels and explore it. And see whether these alleged discoveries from the past can be replicated now, but bring in the scientists from the get-go. So I'm looking at Tuscany as a place to do this. It's a nice place.
Good taste.
And create a contemplative research facility for people who are simply open-minded, but willing to put in the immensely hard work of 10, 12, 14 hours of rigorous training per day for 5, 10 years, and bring in the psychologist, the neuroscientist. I think Marcelo has said maybe he'll come as a physicist.
I'll volunteer.
Volunteer, we got to volunteer. We want physicists because a measurement problem, the role of the observer in quantum mechanics, is not a solved problem. And let's find out together what's true. Because what we know is we don't know what's true. In the modern scientific context, we don't know what's true. What are the origins of consciousness? How does it interface with the brain? What happens at death? We may have beliefs that we're strong convinced are true, and that's fine. Show me how you test that. This is a theory that can be tested, should be tested. And let's just find out what's true.
Okay, very brief.
Very briefly. I want to end by saying a couple of points that Alan has made more than once that I completely agree with. And I think that they are important. One is this idea that there is wisdom to be found in traditions that predate the scientific tradition. I say this very directly in my book, but Western and Eastern. I'm not an expert on Eastern religions or traditions or secular traditions, but I do, try to sneak them in there into the book whenever I can. But the way that I put it was, for thousands of years, the way that human beings thought about the human condition, what it was to be human, in the most careful, rigorous way they possibly could, was in the context of religious and spiritual traditions. The idea that we learn nothing from all of that thinking seems absurd, and we should be open to that. We shouldn't accept it blindly because it's in a book, but we should certainly read some of the books and see maybe there's something in there. And the other point, of course, is intro, and by the way, over half my students are Asian. I don't know whether that means anything,
Not
but
much. They're coming here.
they're great.
To the great colony.
The other point, the importance of introspection and seeing, learning about the mind by being the mind and thinking. I think this is also something that is absolutely worth doing. And in some sense, that's trivial. Of course it's worth doing because everything is worth doing. But I would actually accept the claim that scientists can focus in too narrowly on research methodologies, not because they're necessarily the best or the only ones, but because they're the easiest ones. I always tell my students, go into cosmology if you have a short attention span, because the universe is much simpler than a frog or the United States government, right? And even if you want to study the brain, it's very easy to study neuroscience by looking at what an individual neuron does. There was just a paper that literally came out, I think it was in Cell, that argued that neuroscientists should actually care not just about introspection, but about behavior. And to a non-neuroscientist, you go, wait, they don't care about behavior? This is not something they care about? But yeah, if you can study neuron by neuron what happens, then you can convince yourself that's the only thing to do. I think you should be very, very pluralistic about where we get our information from, and no matter where it comes from and no matter what that information says, we should be very, very careful that we check it, that we're skeptical, because that's how we build up the knowledge piece by piece.
Great, thank you. Great. I think on that note, I think we'll close the evening. We're going to go out and sign books for those of you who are interested in buying them in the lobby. Don't forget the surveys. Thank you very much for coming. See you soon. Thank you.